Podemos, Ravena, aí só fazer a gentileza de resgatar o Andrew lá para se juntar ao painel. Bom, boa noite a todas e todos. É prazer enorme a gente
Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure first for having our final webinar, Brazilian, Australia, the topic of discussion on public policies, prevention of violence against women. We already had very interesting discussion about Federative Pact and public budget for women, international evidence on the prevention of violence against women, policies in education area. Our past webinar was about public policies, public security, and a specialized police station for women. And today we have a topic of discussion that is quite controversial here in Brazil. That is the topic restorative justice in the context of violence based on gender, risks and challenges. And Bruno will introduce all the speakers. Later on, we have colleagues here that are the reference professionals on this topic, either in Australia and also in Brazil. Before starting, I just like to take the opportunity for very briefly to contextualize this topic that we are discussing today. Here in Brazil, in 2017, the National Council of Justice issued a recommendation encouraging all the courts to undertake programs for restorative justice in the context of domestic violence and family violence against women. And it was only a recommendation. We will not make any alert to say take care with this or other topic. And several researchers in Brazil, they reported several problems in these programs of restorative justice, having the offender and the victim face-to-face in a context where the victim was afraid of the offender. And during the programs, they were criticizing the women for certain behavior, for having suffered the violence, in an uneven relationship of power, having some agreements that was damaging the women's situations. In some cases, the program itself is encouraging a reconciliation between the offender and the victim. Facing these problems, all of them reported. In a second moment, the National Council of Justice stopped to encourage this or sort of recall of this guideline. And today, at least my feeling with the professionals in the judicial branch, there's a kind of if try to work with restorative justice due to the elevated risks of re-victimizations when there's no caution about that. On the other hand, we are aware that some countries are advancing in discussions on this topic of restorative justice and trying to meet the expectations of the women when solving their problems in a protected and a safer manner. I published a paper on this topic that I report the several problems, some of these Brazilian experience, and say, I know that in theory it's possible to create a restorative justice since we have the gender perspective included, but what we have been seeing in justice is not the incorporation of this gender perspective. The basic perspective, we are failing to incorporate that. Cases of partners that are drunk and they beat their wives, and when she finally has the courage to request the urgent protective measure, and the judge denies because it says that it's not about the gender, it's about the drinking. I mean, this absolute basic perspectives to understand what is gender-based violence and the risks that the women are submitted and the different events of re-victimization. But in my article, I pointed out that I know what is necessary to tackle that. And here, we are here to listen from the colleagues from Australia that after a domestic violence commission for family violence, they developed a specific program for restorative justice with a specific provision for other contexts of family violence and with all the theoretical efforts to incorporate the gender perspective and how to implement these programs. And on the other side, we have Brazilian experts that will discuss their research in the national context. And the idea is to have this experience exchange to understand a little bit better what is happening in Australia. And so they will learn what is happening in Brazil, and everyone will learn jointly. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Bruno that will mediate the works of this final webinar, and also registering and acknowledging deeply for all of you that are here, especially our colleagues from Australia that had to wake early tonight, this morning, to be with us in this event. So thank you very much for your attention. Good evening, everyone. I am quite happy in being the mediator of this final webinar of this very successful series on the webinar on domestic and family violence against women, an initiative headed by our colleague and friend Tiago Pirbon, funded by the Embassy of Australia, which we acknowledge and thank. And in this afternoon, evening of today, in the early morning in Australia, we have here the pleasure and honor of having Professor Samantha Jeffries that sent a video. She couldn't be with us. Professor Samantha is a researcher and senior lecturer of the Griffith University. Managers, if I may, managers and researchers of the Angel Parks field. And Thami Vu, I don't know if I pronounced correctly her name. They are members of a program known as Family Violence Restorative Justice Service of Victoria in Australia. And subsequently, we will have our professors and researchers, our references in Brazil in this topic. For a long time, Professor Coro Radcamps, the professor of Uniriter, Professor Maria Montenegro Pessoa de Mello, professor of the Federal University of Pernambuco and the Catholic University of Pernambuco. And we will finish with Professor Luana Tomás de Souza from Federal University of Pará State. So without further ado, I'd like to ask to play the video of Professor Samantha Jeffries.
In this presentation, I'm going to be overviewing findings from a qualitative explanatory study looking at the experiences and viewpoints of practitioners and service providers regarding the use of adult RJ conferencing in cases of gender-based violence in Queensland. Adult RJ conferencing for these types of cases has been operating in Queensland since the early 1990s. We sought to understand what victims of gendered violence need from a system of justice, juxtaposing conventional justice against the potential promises of RJ. To discern the perceptual benefits and challenges of utilising adult RJ conferencing in these cases, to establish what a best practice adult RJ conferencing framework might look like, and to identify the training needs of RJ facilitators. So what did we learn? According to interviewees, victims of gendered violence commonly express several justice needs. Firstly, or what was described as being the number one factor, was that victims needed a sense of power within and control over the justice process. Empowerment meant opening a space where victims could give voice to the harm caused, perpetrators were positioned to listen, and victims could ask them questions. It also necessitated extending victims the opportunity for input into justice. Justice systems should be flexible because the needs of victims will vary. Secondly, our interviewees explained that victims needed an acknowledgement of wrongdoing from the offender. Victims needed accountability. But ideally, this accountability would be demonstrated through offender action. Ultimately, victims wanted perpetrators to stop victimizing and abusing. Interviewees expressed that in the aftermath of gendered violence, justice systems should not exacerbate victim isolation and trauma. Justice systems should not be re-victimizing people. Victims required a system of justice that was accessible and safe. The provision of advocacy and support services pre, during and post the justice process was also important. Everyone expressed serious concerns about the ability of conventional justice systems to meet victim needs. The conventional justice system was described as offender-centric, rigid, protracted, unhelpful and hostile for victims, and as enabling the continuation of offender power and control. Accountability, remorse and perpetrator behavioural change were lacking, and as such, victims had no reassurances of safety. Participants identified that RJ may have benefits or improvements over conventional justice. They expressed that it could provide a way for victims to have an input into justice, that it could provide a less intimidating, safer and more amenable environment for victim validation and empowerment, that it could increase opportunities for victims to have a voice, to confront their perpetrator and hold them accountable in a more supportive, victim-focused environment. Thus, RJ may be more aptly situated to censure and hold perpetrators accountable and change their behaviour. RJ was also seen by some as having the potential to change broader societal misconceptions about gendered violence. Finally, the informality and flexibility of RJ allowed it to be adapted to individual needs, producing a more holistic justice response, potentially. However, interviewees still expressed several concerns. First is the challenge of gendered power imbalances, re-victimisation, harm, and whether victims' participation can be voluntary. Second, RJ practitioners reported that victims may lack support persons, but support persons are crucial during RJ because they can help to alleviate the possibility of further psychological distress. Victims are often socially isolated as a result of coercive control, and victims don't want people to know what they've experienced. It was noted that while the retelling of victims' stories was a key component of an RJ conference, this posed significant re-victimisation and re-traumatisation risks. Another challenge was perpetrator accountability and apologies. Interviewees concerned about the ability of perpetrators to be accountable for their offending. These types of offenders can be highly manipulative, frequently deny responsibility for their actions, victim blame, minimise their actions, and lack empathy. Disquiet was also expressed around perpetrators potentially using RJ to access victims. Concerns around the ability of offenders to accept accountability, coupled with the extreme power imbalance and trauma inherent in these types of offences, led some interviewees to question the applicability, authenticity, and safety of apologies provided as part of the RJ process. There were misgivings that a singular RJ conference would be unable to make any headway in holding perpetrators to account. For interviewees, the true measure of accountability was perpetrator behavioural change, or evidence of commitment to this. Uneasiness was articulated around RJ approaching gendered violence as a one-off incident. There was apprehension around the idea of facilitator neutrality and impartiality. Interviewees voiced that there might be broader negative implications of utilising RJ in these types of cases. These challenges and issues elicited suggestions around how such problems might be addressed or should be addressed. For everyone, the first step towards best practice was to ensure that RJ operated from a victim-centred position. What victims needed from a system of justice should underpin RJ. Broadly speaking, this would incorporate victim empowerment, control, validation, safety, support, offender accountability and remorse, and ultimately healing from the harms caused. RJ needed to be victim-centred and safe, which necessitates process flexibility because the pathway to and prioritisation of victims' needs will differ. It requires giving victims choice and customising RJ accordingly to what victims want or needs in terms of holding the perpetrator accountable. Likewise, what do victims need around expressions of remorse? RJ was seen as a conversation that takes place on a continuum starting pre-conference and continuing through post-conference. I'm now going to run you through what interviewees had in mind regarding best practice at each stage. Interviewees were clear that pre-conference preparation was central to RJ best practice. During pre-conference, this was a place where the restorative conversation started. Pre-conference preparation was not a one-off meeting, but a series of exchanges between facilitators, victims, offenders, and others, including, for example, extended family, support persons, and specialist support providers. Pre-conference was described as being a process of ongoing preparation, assessment, and monitoring. The first best practice requirement during RJ's preparatory phase was the provision of information to victims and offenders. Second, the pre-conference phase was central to developing a shared sense of the offending. This was important for ensuring a process where victims' experiences could be validated and to avert the potential for victim blaming and in turn re-victimization and re-traumatization. In terms of victim safety, it was noted that the preparatory phase should comprise a screening process where safety is discussed and safety perimeters are set. In cases where there were ongoing relationships, these safety assessments would need to happen more than once. Safety considerations should also extend beyond the victim to include other potential or actual victims. Support persons also needed to be fully assessed. Victims' needs and expectations alongside their capacity to participate should be established in this pre-conference phase. This phase is all about supporting victims to make a decision that's based on their own needs and ensuring that they are not subsuming these needs to others. To achieve this required an understanding of power dynamics and what victims need in terms of justice, accountability, and apology. Trauma histories can create barriers to victim participation. Thus, the pre-conference phase should be used to establish strategies and work with victims to manage this. Laying the groundwork for offender participation pre-conference was also vital. Here, supporting perpetrators to take accountability and demonstrate remorse via behavioural change was imperative. Assessing and working with victims pre-conference was not something that RJ practitioners should be doing alone. Rather, this crucial foundational work needed to be undertaken in tandem with domestic and sexual violence support services and therapeutic providers. For offenders, the importance of having experts in gender-based violence working alongside RJ practitioners during the pre-conference phase was again emphasised. Now I'm going to move on to look at what the people we spoke to suggested with regards to best practice in the actual conference. First, the timing of conference was considered important. Second, some interviewees argued that ensuring victim emotional well-being and safety required a two-facilitator model. Ideally, it was argued that the conference should be working as a hybrid situation where you had a female and male convener working together. Some participants saw mixed gender conference facilitation as decisive for several reasons, while others questioned this. Regardless, given that RJ needed to be victim-centred, ultimately this should be the victim's decision. Participation in conference by actors from conventional criminal justice system was also discussed. It was expressed that having police in conferences could provide an authoritative element. This could counteract concerns about the state divesting responsibility for justice and communicate that gendered violence is being taken seriously. Police presence could also be important for victim validation and the provision of safety. However, it is not uncommon for victims of domestic and sexual violence to have experienced failed police responses in the past. So whether police should be present in the conference needed to be assessed on a case-by-case basis, but should be an option decided by the victim. If a police officer was going to be involved, it needed to be someone with specialised training. As already discussed, support persons will have been adequately screened for suitability pre-conference. In addition, as was the case pre-conference, specialised victim advocates would ideally be present. Conference best practice should also include close management of participant arrival and departure times to ensure safety alongside the taking of breaks. While narrating the facts of an offence is common in conference practice, interviewees suggested this be reconsidered for these types of cases. It was argued that post-conference RJ follow-up with victims and offenders was essential. Interviewees were adamant that RJ should be operating in tandem with expert support services and therapeutic providers. Facilitators needed to be experts in RJ, not gender-based violence. Nevertheless, they should be equipped with some expertise in this area to ensure efficacy of process. Thank you for your time. A link to our full publication, where you will get more details than I can provide in 15 minutes, can be found at this site.
Bom, obrigado. Dando seguimento com os nossos convidados.
Thank you very much. Now proceeding with our Australian guests, I'll pass the floor now to Andrew Parks, and right after that to Tony Vu for 15 minutes each, or 30 minutes in total, to continue this conference. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you, Bruno, and thanks so much, everyone, for having us along this evening, your time, and this morning, our time. It's great to be able to connect with you from so far away. And I'll just start our presentation on our program, the Family Violence Restorative Justice Service, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that we're presenting from today in Victoria. And for me, that's the land of the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations. Pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'll just try and share my screen, if hopefully that works, and I can start our presentation. Is everyone able to see that?
Yeah, we can see it.
Yep, great. Yeah. Okay, thanks everyone. So we'll just start off with a bit of background of our program and how we were established. And it was great listening to Dr. Jeffrey's research then, because so much of what we heard in establishing our program really echoes the research of Dr. Jeffrey's and the kind of safeguards and practice that is needed to safely ensure participation of victim survivors and deliver the benefits that restorative justice can provide. So we, as a program, we were established from one of the recommendations of a Royal Commission into Family Violence that Victoria held a number of years ago. The report was handed down in late 2016, and that provided a great opportunity to really, from a systemic level, really rethink how family violence is understood as a gendered form of violence, and how the system is designed to respond to victim survivors to keep people safe and address the underlying drivers of family violence as well. As part of that Royal Commission, the report recommended that a framework and pilot program be developed for a restorative justice option for victim survivors of family violence. And what that suggested it do is really meet the justice needs that victim survivors have that Dr. Jeffries outlined in that presentation earlier, that the criminal justice system often doesn't meet at all or doesn't do a good job of meeting. The Royal Commission really identified that restorative justice has the potential to meet a lot of those justice needs. So we initially did a lot of consultation where we spoke with experts in restorative justice, practitioners in the family violence fields, members throughout the legal and the justice system here, and developed a framework which sets out the principles that we'll talk through a little bit later, and the considerations needed to safely design and implement a restorative justice program for victim survivors. So we are a victim-centred program, which when we provide restorative justice options to victim survivors, we support victim survivors to speak about the harm they've experienced with people that are important to them. And we do operate really, I guess the key of that victim-centred nature of our program is that a restorative justice response looks different for each person that we work with. That can involve the person responsible for the harm that they've experienced, if it's assessed as safe to do so, and if that will meet the needs of the victim survivor, but they don't have to participate, and it doesn't have to involve the person responsible. Other people that might be important to them that can be involved in a process can be other family members, siblings, parents, perhaps, anyone that's important in a victim survivor's life that can help address their needs and help them move on. We operate outside the traditional criminal justice system, so we're not linked to any other justice processes. And we don't have any formal referral pathways from courts or justice processes in that sense, which really gives us the flexibility to ensure voluntary participation of everyone and ensure that we can work with victim survivors and other participants for as long as possible and as long as is needed in each case. We have two key practitioner roles in the team. Specialist support workers, of which two in our team have joined us today, Tammy and Sylvia Carito as well from our teams here today, two specialist support workers. So the focus of their work in the team is, it's really the upfront work in working with victim survivors and other participants. Specialist support workers intake victim survivors and others into the program, take care of the risk assessments, which is a key focus of our work, and address any support needs, either by providing support throughout their engagement with us, or by facilitating referrals into other support that they might need. Our other practice role is that of a convener, which they work very closely with specialist support workers. It really is sort of a team model in approaching the work, and conveners support the telling of the story and identification of those restorative justice goals that victim survivors are wanting to meet in our program, identify the other participants that will help meet those goals, and prepare everyone, and then facilitate the restorative justice process as well. As I mentioned, those justice needs that we're hoping to meet through our work, and I guess flow on from what the Royal Commission identified restorative justice as being able to meet, as outlined here. Voice really is, I guess, one of the key ones in our program, because often, especially in the traditional criminal justice system here in Victoria, victim survivors often don't have a say in how their case is managed, or the court process, or decisions that are made about their case. They're often sidelined in the justice process. And restorative justice, particularly in a victim-centred model, really does have the opportunity to place them at the centre of a process that can meet their justice needs and provide that opportunity for voice. Validation, information, accountability, particularly if the person responsible is involved in the process. Relationships, so that can be repairing or restoring relationships with people important to them, or even the relationship with themselves and helping in that recovery from the harm they've experienced. Prevention and resolution as well. Often our work is with people that have done a lot of work on their own, perhaps through counselling or therapeutic work, but just have that extra need that can only be done with other people and having conversations with other people. And that's how restorative justice can help safely meet that need. So these are our principles that sort of govern our work, and the principles here form the sort of key part of the framework that was developed at the beginning of the program being established. At the centre there is being a victim-centred program. Other principles there, many of them are very common in any restorative justice program, particularly do no further harm, voluntary participation as well. And some are probably more geared specifically to our work in family violence, particularly the person responsible accepting responsibility for the harm they've caused. That can be, that threshold of responsibility and acknowledgement of the harm they've caused can be different in each case, but that's part of the key work that our practitioners do, is assessing that with each person responsible if they are involved in the process. Appropriate resources and skills, I guess, speaks to especially the key restorative justice skills that our conveners need, but also our specialist support workers do as well. And having appropriate and sufficient resources in each case. So making sure that people are supported the whole way through and are able to be linked into other supports when needed as well. Integrated justice, that principle speaks to our relationship with the broader justice system, as I mentioned, where we sit outside or alongside the criminal justice system. People don't have to have reported a crime of family violence to be involved in our program if they are a victim survivor. And if they are engaged with other parts of the justice system, we can still work with them. That's just something we take into account in our safety assessments and making sure that they're safe and able to participate. And transparency of process and outcomes, I think, really speaks to working with people, which I think for victim survivors is really important, because we, I guess, again, in contrast to the criminal justice system, don't want to make decisions for people or do things to them. We work with people alongside them to come to decisions together and how each case is handled. And I'll just pass over to Tammy now for the next little bit.
Thank you. So in terms of how people come into our service, victim survivors can refer themselves. So we call that self-referrals, or the referrals could come through support services or agencies that they're working with. So that could be a sexual assault service or family violence service or some other counselling service. The common characteristics that most of our victim survivors share is that obviously we are a family violence restorative justice program, so they have to be identified as being a victim survivor of family violence. And that's, I guess, that fits into the framework of the Family Violence Protection Act, how family violence and how relationships are defined within that act in Victoria. Many victim survivors want to have a conversation that they otherwise are unable to, so they want it to be facilitated in some way. And a lot of what we're finding is that quite a number of people that have come into our service have been either cut off or have been estranged or have lost contact with their families. And I guess that speaks to the fact of the repercussions that family violence often have on wider relationships. And often people feel, in some cases, they might feel there's a sense of shame, a lot of frustration, a sense of being isolated, alone in their experience. And so needing, I guess, part of wanting to engage in a restorative process is wanting to have some sense of closure as well. Yep. And I guess some of that also speaks to often the experience of family violence is like a secret that they've kept, because it's something that I guess our community or our society does not talk about family violence or sexual abuse within families openly. And so that often speaks to, I guess, the shame that people might feel as well. In terms of eligibility for the service, we don't have many. The key ones are that they have to be, I guess, a victim survivor of family violence. They either live in Victoria or that the experience of family violence had taken place in Victoria, and that they're not at high risk. So in Victoria, we have what we call a MARAM, which stands for a multi-agency risk assessment and management framework. And that's the tool that we use to assess whether a victim survivor is at low risk or elevated risk or at high risk. And so I guess in order for people to participate safely in our program, we require that they're currently not experiencing high level of risk, because it may not be safe for them to participate in the program otherwise. And the other one is that there's no serious or ongoing justice, legal or court matters at the moment. So it could be a criminal justice matter, but it may also be other matters such as, like family law or child protection legal proceedings. It doesn't mean that they're not eligible later on, but it just means that we don't want to prejudice the current legal proceedings that they might have going on at the moment. So we might just pause the process and wait for that those legal and court processes to be over or resolved, and then, we can continue with restorative justice later on. Some examples of referrals that have come into our service includes a mother who wanted to have a conversation with her adult son who had used violence against her. He has since moved out of home. Another one is a young woman who grew up in a household where her father was very violent. And now as an adult, she wants to have a conversation with him about the impact of the violence that he perpetrated against her and her siblings, and what that had on her in terms of her relationships with other people, and the impact on her mental health later on in life. And the last one, an example here is one that we recently closed, and that was a woman who wanted to have a conversation with her brother about the sexual abuse that he perpetrated against her when they were younger. And it's noted that, both siblings didn't experienced abuse themselves when they were growing up. And, they're both adults now, and they both live within the same city. And she spoke about that she has contacts with him every now and then, but the contact is often quite superficial. And she sees the possibility for them to have, a positive relationship if they could talk about the abuse that had taken place. In terms of the processes at our service, at the moment, I guess, I guess the process of engagement often begins with either, someone contacting the service, whether that's, for a referral, for an inquiry, and we would assess their eligibility. We go through an intake process, and that's basically about, taking down their personal details, doing a risk and safety assessment, making sure that they're linked in with support services, and ensuring that they're in a place where restorative justice would be suitable to meet their needs. So I guess the first two phases are mostly done by myself and Sylvia, the specialist support worker. At stage 3, we start introducing our conveners into the process. And at this stage, the convener and the specialist support workers are working together, I guess, to assess, and to work with the person harmed, the victim survivors, around, what it is that they're hoping to get out of their process, what their goals are, who they would like to have conversations with, what are their needs. And then I guess the conveners, in tandem with the victim survivor, develop a restorative justice process options. So that's just kind of like brainstorming different restorative justice processes that could meet the victim survivor's needs. And then from then on, it's about contacting other people that may be involved in that the victim survivor wants involved in the process. So that could be the person that has caused them harm, but it could be also, like, for example, in the case that I spoke about the young woman that experienced family violence from her dad as a child, in that case, we're also thinking about contacting her siblings as well. And the conveners then, I guess, does the preparation process with all the participants to ensure that people are ready for restorative process. The specialist support workers also works with the other participants, and that includes assessing people's suitability and safety and risk needs as well. The restorative process can be direct or indirect. An example of an indirect process could be like a letter exchange. And once a restorative process is completed, both the specialist support workers and the conveners do follow-up work with everyone that's involved. And that includes, debriefing, but as well as, having conversations around whether, their support needs have been met and whether there might be other things that might be required to further meet their support needs. And that might be a referral onto other agencies as well. The restorative process, I guess, is the accumulation of all of the preparation work that we've done with all of the participants, and who participates and how they participate is really guided by the victim survivor. So examples of that could be, in some cases, if needed, we might look at a shuttle process, so where the person responsible for harm is in a different room from our victim survivor. And there may be a series of conversations, so it's not just one conversation. And again, I go back to the example of the young woman that experienced violence from her dad as a child. So with that one, the planning that is currently taking place is that we might have the woman having conversations with her siblings first, so that she has the support of her siblings and that they're all on the same page in regards to their childhood experiences with the father. And so that's one process. And then at a later stage, we might bring the father, our client, the victim survivor, might have a conversation with her dad, knowing that she has the support of her siblings behind her as well. So it may not just be one conversation, it could be a series of different conversations. The specialist support workers provide support to ensure that both formal and informal supports are in place. So that could be that the specialist support worker might be in the same room at the conference to provide support to our victim survivor, or they could be outside of the room to talk to them and provide support during breaks. But it could be also about linking external services in to support our victim survivors as well. And as spoken to by the previous speaker, we do use a co-facilitated two conveners model. And I guess that's just in line with the research around best practice. So we have a lead convener who guide the participants through what happened, how people have been affected, and what needs to happen to improve things in the future. But there's also a support convener as well that works alongside with the lead convener. And that's just to help guide the process, but also during the conference, the support convener is able to also keep an eye out on all participants and where people are at, and to provide extra support where needed as well. So in terms of safeguards, safeguards.
Am I jumping back in, Tammy, or
yeah.
I can jump back in if you want? You've done a lot of speaking then. Thanks, Tammy. So I guess safeguards, ideally there are safeguards throughout our engagement with all participants, particularly victim survivors. But getting to the whole process, including the conference itself, risk is assessed throughout the engagement of a victim survivor with us, and all participants as well when they start working with us. We do that thorough risk assessment at the beginning through that intake process, but that's revisited throughout someone's engagement with us. The extensive preparation period is really important for us, and I think speaks to Dr. Jeffrey's research as well. We've found through our program that is really where our work happens, is that extensive preparation period. That can go for months and months to make sure that everyone's properly prepared and ready for a conference. And the conference itself, the actual restorative process, is one of the smallest parts of our work, really, and is just the result of all that preparation. The co-convening model, as Tammy mentioned, is important in ensuring the safety of everyone in the actual conference itself. That principle of perpetrator accepting responsibility is important as well. If a person responsible is going to be involved, they have to accept a level of responsibility or have a level of accountability that can meet the needs of each victim survivor, and that's assessed pretty thoroughly. We have support for all participants, and there is a set plan, and part of that staged approach to our engagement. You might have noticed there is a set stage for planning the actual process itself, and ideally there are no surprises in a restorative conference. It can be a lot of emotion and feeling through a conference, but no surprises about what's going to be spoken about and how it will be structured. And as Sylvia mentioned as well, there's the option of indirect or shuttle processes too, if that's the safest option. And follow up as well, as Tammy mentioned, immediately after a process, participants are debriefed by a specialist support worker. Then we have a follow-up conversation with the convener and the participants 1 week later. And if there are any outcome agreements, it's not a necessity in our work that there be an outcome agreement from a conference, but if there is any outcome agreement, we help monitor that. But it is also something that we would hand over to participants to implement as well, and make sure that participants, whether it's the victim survivors themselves or other participants, have enough support ongoing and facilitate referrals as needed. I might come back to you, Tammy.
Yeah, like I guess this slide links back to an earlier slide that Andrew spoke to about victim survivors' justice needs. And so I guess the possible outcomes that we're finding within our service is that it does give voice and validation to victim survivors. In some cases, it can also widen their community of support. So I spoke to you about, that we might bring in other family members who could also back up the victim survivor or who were around at the time when the abuse occurred, to acknowledge and that those events did take place. Restorative justice does present as an alternative to traditional justice. It offers a safe place for people to communicate with their family members or people that have caused them harm. And in what we're finding is that in victim survivors, having that safe space to tell their story and also to ask questions of the person that has caused them harm has really, I guess, promoted and increased victim survivors' self-esteem, their own self-agency, their self-confidence, and that's, I think, speaks to the notion of empowerment. I spoke to the opportunity to ask questions and receive answers, and that's quite a common theme. For people that have worked with victim survivors, the traditional justice system doesn't allow that. And often, even when a matter is resolved in the courts, a lot of victim survivors still have a lot of questions that are unanswered. And restorative justice does to provide them that safe space to ask those questions. And the person responsible is held to account and they're kept in view of the service. Yeah. There's also, like possible positive outcomes for people who use harm or perpetrators. And that can be, like depending on how restorative justice is shaped, because our processes is developed around the needs of victim survivors. So it looks a little bit different each time. So in some cases, there might be not just immediate family members, but other community members that might be brought in. And so those behavior can be challenged by the community as well. Perpetrators you know, because there's so much preparation that is done with people that have caused harm or are responsible for harm, that, you know, it's provides them with a really good opportunity that I think the traditional justice system doesn't allow. And that is, you know, there's an opportunity for them to have a better understanding around their behavior and the consequences of their actions. It allows them to develop insight into why they behaved, why they were violent, or why they behaved in the way that they did, and allow them to make other choices. It also allows people that have caused harm to, I guess, in some cases, repair relationships or repair harm, yeah, and make amends for their behavior as well. And I think that's
it, yeah.
Presentation.
Thanks, everyone. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Tammy. Thank you, Andrew. Carmen, posso passar a palavra a você?
Carmen, I can give the floor to you. Welcome. Yes, thank you very much. Can I start? Yes? Yes. So I'd like to start. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Thiago, for all your efforts. I attended most of the events and they were very interesting. So congratulations for all the effort, the organization. Thank you very much for the invitation. I also would like to greet Tammy, Andrew, Marilia, Bruno, and Luana that are here with us in this seminar discussing this topic. We can see that Australia has a huge background in this discussion about restorative justice, not only about domestic and family violence, but also experience, at least for the best of my knowledge, in different areas. For instance, in sexual abuse between adult persons, sexual crimes. We are not in this moment yet. I'm going to share my presentation. Can you see my screen? Yes, okay. I think that we are not at the same development level in theory, in practical that Australia is in gender-based violence. And why do I say that? Because for our case, the discussion, let me just set up my time. Okay. In our case, restorative justice, the discussions around restorative justice on gender-based violence is limited to domestic violence. And I think that's a very important constraint, negatively speaking, for restorative justice possibilities in Brazil. So identify gender-based violence with domestic violence, reduce the two scopes, the gender-based violence that is not only domestic violence, and also the restorative justice's possibilities for other fields that are not on domestic violence that are very controversial areas. And what are the characteristics, the features of this field that discusses gender-based violence almost exclusively as via domestic violence? Different from the experience that we just saw in Australia, our restorative justice is a judicial justice. Its protagonism is concentrating in the judiciary branch. That's been encouraged, and Thiago said that in the opening session, the restorative practices from the National Council of Justice with a number of resolutions and provisions. considering domestic violence, restorative practices, they are quite residual, at least from the researches that I've been seeing. There are fewer and they are applied in few courts over the country. And another hardship that we have is that there are few studies with methodologies that assess these practices and that are not limited to assess the user's satisfaction. We have a lot of researchers that inquires how the users feel, but they do not assess the restorative justice promises. For instance, empowerment and the repair themselves. There are two important concepts for restorative justice. So how do we have, in fact, the victim's empowerment and how the repair is offered? So we do not have research, at least for the best of my knowledge, that assess these restorative justice promises.
That comes from an issue that we have right now from the ones that are not in justice system to carry out research on the judiciary system. There is a resistance in the judiciary service to allow us, professors, men and women who are not from the justice system, to execute researches there. For instance, for us to analyze this restorative practice, at least here in Rio Grande do Sul, it is mandatory for you to have a course of a facilitator. So, and this makes it harder for us. And I'll talk about some researches that have been done, or surveys that have been done in the Rio Grande do Sul system in areas with the domestic violence. And although the National Council of Justice has surveys that shows that there are practices in different parts of the country, but I'll discuss six of the most recent here in the state of Rio Grande do Sul. The first one is, it was carried out by a civil servant that she analyzed some projects in this area in the city of Porto Alegre, and she has analyzed between 2015 and 2019, 53 suits sent to individual services. It's important to say that that the theoretical perspective of restorative justice, at least in Brazil, or more specifically here in Rio Grande do Sul, is based upon the Cave Bruni in peace. In 4 procedures in domestic violence, and some of them have been analyzed because the number of the suits or procedures, rather, that go to the restorative practices are very few. In this survey, there has been 15 cases, well, 53 cases sent, and in 15, there has been an agreement, and according to the assessment, domestic violence, and 16 cases, they're not able to do that. And they were involved, but they agreed to participate, but never showed up. And if we add those cases of non-participation or no follow-up, it's around 71%. So most people have not participated in restorative practice. But that may be a success case. The ones that were sent to restorative justice, those are cases where there's no sexual violence or bodily harm, and cases considered of a low severity and without recurring violence, which allow us to ask, well, perhaps the restorative justice is only done in light cases, in soft cases, rather. And there is a statement under this analysis that there were no repetition of the crime, and that is a positive aspect. And there's no more information on is on this repetition, so that means that new violences, but they never ask why new violences did not take place. Was it for the fact that this violence has not existed, in fact, or both parties, especially women, understood that this practice has not taken to anything? Well, the other case, the other survey that has analyzed this very field of study, the same project, is one that was done in 2015, 2020, actually, Michelle Santos, that will say that the conclusion she reaches is the restorative practices in this that were observed, well, were three different courts. They're not alternative to the current model. And this is interesting because one of the discourses of the restorative practice is that it is a contraposition to the penal system that doesn't answer to the demands of the victims. And this survey will say the following, that the practices analyzed, they're not constituted into an alternative model to the penal system. And that this idea of the values of restorative justice with dialogue and restoration of the relationship, the broken relationship, they are not confirmed, and they end up reassuring the perspective, the current penal perspective, because they do not go against such perspective. Well, another survey done in the Domestic Violence Forum will identify, and is concerned with that, certainly, what are the tools used. So it will bring as tools the peace reparation cycle, and a service with aggressive men, and with the couples that do not want to be separated. So we see the practices here are varied, both with women as well as men perpetrators of violence. And it calls the attention. They have the direct referral sent to restorative services by the magistrate, and that may influence in both parties. Another survey that has been carried out, that happened in Novo Hamburgo, also identified these, and this was in 2019, has identified that restorative practices, they're translated into a normalizing management of the family and re-victimization of the women, which is an absence of problematics of the violence or the drivers. Basically, it is a structural, it's not treated as structural, and there's no concern with gender, class, social class, and race. And that because all the materials used, as I have mentioned, is the K apprentice that has this individual perspective with a search of the actual self and a concern translated in practice, not necessarily being that the perspective or not, but translated in practice as a strengthening of the family perspectives. And also they observed that this material used in practice, which was observed and showed criticism to the religion and considered to put different religions in different areas. So some of them would be more spiritualized and others would be less. And finally, I want to mention the Jaqueline's Paidão, which was something that happened in Novo Hamburgo, where Jaqueline has interviewed women, has interviewed the people who, or the facilitators rather, and also observed the use of a family and infantilizing view of women, and the women understood restoration as joining together with the couple, and they understood this justice as a therapy and not as justice, and there hasn't been the reparation of damage. And we also observed, and the other surveys also show, an absence of specific training in gender violence or gender-based violence, and a lack of understanding of the different complex dynamics of the gender based violence, and an absence of criteria to refer those cases to restorative justice. Some severe cases have not been sent, others have, so there's no actual criteria for the referral of these cases. And I wonder, well, what does that shows that at least here in the state, restorative justice, or at least their practices, they have not empowered women. They have not left this feminist view, if I may, and they have a perspective that is much more towards therapy. And the women understand, at least the ones that heard women, understand that restoration is the couple going back together. So that brings a lot of issues for those practices of domestic violence. And I wonder why we only look at the gender violence as domestic violence. Perhaps couldn't we think about other possibilities of restorative justice? Femicide cases, for instance, is just an exercise that I don't even have the answers for that right now. But sexual harassment in schools, university, in the workplace, in health, political violence, the prison system. Wouldn't it be more interesting to think about these possibilities of restorative justice in the other areas? So not only domestic violence, not necessarily within the family. I'm not saying that it is not interesting. I believe what we see in Australia, that shows it's interesting to do it. But the way we're doing in Brazil brings many questions. And just to close, as challenges from those questions, I believe we must break with the idea that the restorative justice must be for domestic violence, which is an area that is much more problematic, and or only in the individual field. And this is something that we still have because it is born with this perspective. And I believe we must link this idea of restorative justice to the gender, class, and race, and work with more structuring areas, not only individual ones. And for that, we must increase the idea of damage. It must be social damage, because gender violence promotes a social damage, and not only an individual damage or harm, rather. So it is a challenge for us to leave this box of domestic violence and to think about the possibilities and widen the horizons of restorative justice towards a place where we can link with more structuring perspectives, with public policies and institutional policies that are wider at the end of the day. And that's what I wanted to bring, and I wanted to provoke, to be thought-provoking in this first moment. Thank you. Thank you, Carmen. I pass the floor to Professor Marília Montenegro. Marília, welcome once again.
O seu microfone está desligado.
Your microphone is off.
Estão conseguindo ver a tela, gente? Estão conseguindo?
Sim, Marília.
Can you see my screen? Okay, I apologize. For me, it disappeared. So I was not able to see you nor your slide. So it is great to be here. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank everyone who spoke before me, with Carmen, with Tiago and others. It's great to hear the colleague that came right before me. I just want to go back a little bit to these issues I was contemplated with what Carmen has brought and the reflections that have been brought. And I wanted to follow in this reflexive thought and think about the scenarios that we have. I'm talking about Pernambuco. I'm in the northeast of Brazil. And for instance, here we do not have restorative experience in domestic violence, different from Rio Grande do Sul. Here in Pernambuco, we have a lot more in child services, or what we call the JAR. We have this football fan court, but we don't see that in the domestic violence court, either the capital or in the countryside. And when we carried out the survey that I will attempt to summarize, in the cities that I have researched, we didn't see that justice being restored, being used that much in those spaces nor places. And in that moment, they were not applied. We knew that in the countryside there was, but not in the capital. But when the survey was done, Professor Vera Andrade, they also did that, and they did a survey in some areas of the country, and they found experiences with this understanding of what would be this restorative justice, and but very few cases actually involving that justice. And I believe this is very important for us to reflect upon. And then within that, what comes to us, well, our team has been working with restorative justice and domestic violence way before Maria da Penha law was enacted. So we saw the whole criticism against the 1990 law and all the issues on that, and in the different penal alternatives that went away, that we have here in Article 41 of the Maria da Penha law. when it takes away the 1990 law, and we see this agreement, and you see this figure of domestic violence is removed from this context. And I believe it's important for us to think, well, about what we have heard. What are the alternatives? I believe this is important. And in Brazil, and Carmen has brought that quite well, where do we add restorative justice to it? Because apparently, when we visualize that, especially in domestic violence, it comes as a punishment reinforcement and not as an alternative. And this is an important piece of data for us to bear in mind. What would be this restorative justice? And then I'd like to hear from our colleagues also the other experiences. When these situations arise, that in Brazil, they mistake that with the so-called family constellations in therapies, because they are brought, but the fact is, what is the impact of that in the penal process? Because, well, it continues following the course.
So I think this is a very important point. Another thing is, who do we find at the domestic violence courts, and maybe these therapeutic spaces, space that sometimes
porque talvez sejam mulheres que não tiveram
we can
possibilidade.
find positive responses from women, because maybe these women, they didn't have the chance to find that comfort in other spaces. And it's important data for us to consider. And when we develop this research, we assess the socioeconomic profile of the person of conflict in the domestic violence courts in the cities that we surveyed that represented, let's say, all the regions of our country. So we have two capitals in the Northeast region, Recife and Maceió, a capital on the North region, Belém, Brasília in the Center West, São Paulo, and Porto Alegre city. So to think the socioeconomic profile, despite the socioeconomic perspectives, we will find persons with a relatively similar income, a similar age range or education level of these persons that are within the domestic violence cycle. And some data for us are quite remarkable. And this is a data that appears a lot, either in the quantitative phase or in the listening phases, that these relationships, they might be long-term relationships. In the domestic violence, we can find primarily the relationships and also a long relationship. And just a very briefly, this data is from Recife. It could be different city, but as I am here, my city, more than 15 years or 30-year relationship, 35% of the women. So it is a relationship, decade relationship. Most of these women, they have children with this partner. So to think on this structure that enables the violence, domestic violence. So when we look at the restorative justice, and I don't want to say that this is something good or not, but we need to think on what we have in our hands today. Because all of us, we pointed a lot of problems and criticism that are important, and I agree. But my concern, it is to find alternatives with what we have today. What is wrong with what we have today? Because anything that we introduce in this wrong environment will not work. If I have a structure that is working with problems that are around gender aspects, is the restorative justice that brought it, or does it reflect what our system reproduces? Was the 99 law with the criminal translation of the constitutional creation of the process that enabled that? Or did it bring to light what we live with regard to this issue? So I think that's very important for us to discuss that, this vision from the 80s to the 90s, and what we have today with the system, with the implementation of this so important law for all of us, that is the Maria da Penha law, and the hardships that we have. And here I'm going to limit myself to the hardships, that is criminal access for this system, but also the hardship of these issues of to leave the criminal system, the criminal justice system, and develop in other levels, and to develop these perspectives in different localities, that not only in the judicial level and not only in the justice or a court that is dominated by the punishment logic. I think that's a very important thing for us to discuss. Anything that we might introduce in a system that is so contaminated, it will be contaminated as well. So the issues of placing the women in embarrassment places are the situation have because the restorative justice represents only few points, or the structure of the criminal justice of Brazil is this way when handles with women violence. This question is very important. Nonetheless, we will reinforce a system that re-victimize women without conceiving alternatives for this system. I'm not saying that restorative justice is good or not, but I think that if it is an alternative for what we have, it is important to think about it. So it is important for us to try to reflect here as well. Another thing that what brings women, these changings of different criminal types, except for São Paulo, what we found is there are few condemnations, few sentences in the domestic courts. But are you defending the condemnation, the conviction? No, it's not defending, but it's what means this low conviction rate. What does it represent? So we have this huge elapse of time barrier, or we have the end of the case because of the lack of evidence. So it almost says that the woman was wrong all the time. So I give the power to the man. So who gives the power for the man? For many times it's the criminal, for many times the criminal justice system. And the reflection for beyond the restorative justice that can be related to criminal alternatives, when we separate some of these alternatives, such as the process, the conditioning process, the suspension, maybe we will step away some other possibilities that might meet the victim's needs. So maybe to think about it, it's very important. So I'm going to accelerate my presentation for the purpose of the time. You have still 5 minutes. Okay, oh, that's great. We found in the judges in these cities that we researched. It's a very important and relevant data for all of us here, is that one of the questions for the magistrates was what would encourage the judge to be in a domestic violence court. And for this question, the answers were different, very different, but we didn't find the answer because I studied, because I am an expert, and because I prepared myself for being here. No, the answer was I wanted to leave the inward of the country for the capital. I want to be close to my hometown. So we see that we created a very important place that is specialized level, but the experts are not there. In the absence of these experts in these places impacts what happens in this space. So many of the judges, they follows a criminal court logics that where they have been working for many times. And to arrive in this place, what does it mean? What does it mean effectively? And another important moment in this research, maybe it was the most important one, it was the conversations with the multidisciplinary teams, the work that they develop and how they are working. And they, you see, yes, and I'm going to talk effectively about the women professions. And many times they think on techniques, restorative techniques and practices more than the justice system or the prosecution office or the defender's office. And the possibility is that these specialized teams, they find a dialogue with the judicial part. So the absence of this dialogue, I'd like to raise that, this dialogue that sometimes they do not take place between the justice and the psychosocial support team. And we don't have this dialogue out of that when we try to broad these issues for broader issues and also to listen from all the areas from different knowledge and expertise. And I believe this is a call for action for all of us. And here there's a very important statement from one of the psychologists that we interviewed, that for us, from the psychology, we need to appropriate for some point of the law, but I feel that in different psychological and social aspects that the judge, they also need to appropriate from them. And I believe that it's beyond the judge. I believe here all our formation, this analysis, our role in this call here from this psychologist. Another data, it's about this system that we are talking, discussing here, where the women, and this is the statement from an intern of psychology, that they are called to the hearing, screaming their name. So the question, why do you scream? How do you call her name this way? So it's important to think on how we need to establish our own process. And in the interviews with all the victims from different cities of the country, we see that they will have a new problem. Sometimes they left the original problem, that is the domestic violence, and now she has another problem, that is the criminal procedure that has no end. So the idea of re-victimization, the lack of sensibility, the sensitiveness, the procedural burden of that woman then when she wanted to turn the page of her life in a different moment or in a new relationship. And when we ask this woman if she would recommend special research, she recommends only because she doesn't have other thing. And I promise that I'm heading to the conclusion. But I really want to share with you, this is another research. The first research was a research funded by the National Council of Justice. The second research was a partnership with DDD, but involved the custody hearings, the detention control hearings, and the domestic violence that was much focused, specifically. Professor Manuel has a broader focus. And I would like to share something that we found. If it's finished, why are you still with it? That is the second time that you are in the police station. I'm thinking on arresting you. I already have arrested a breach, a lawyer. Would you turn to a criminal? But that's what you want. So stop. If you have the chance, you will have an electronic bracelet to stop. There is nothing like this because you are a woman or a man. There's nothing to do about that. No one knows, no one where you slept. Saw flowers with 5 stars, and he's talking about the prison that he spent the night. And I would like to finish with this reflection of what the criminal justice expected from them. For many times they welcome the man because this is a space with this labeling of a raper and a criminal, or this idea of who beats the woman. It's not equal for all other criminal acts. So this data and respect on how the men are treated, it reflects what we are socially speaking. And the question is, would you like to treat them as traffickers, criminals, etc.? It's our thinking about that, to do that. And here we find a way more complex situation. The domestic violence process against women with the public prosecution office, judicial, usually demand from the victim, and maybe this is the biggest problem, the biggest process of re-victimization, when it's considered, when it went through the criminal honesty process that collaborates with this dehumanization process of her partner or former partner, and in most of the cases also the father of the children. Being necessary that during the process, this man moves from the condition of father of a family, of worker, to the criminal. So that conversation that we have had before, do you want to turn into to become a criminal? Because it's a kind of a dilemma. I'm not here on the criminal justice and you don't fit as a criminal. But yes, if it would help you to become that, so okay, and does you want to become to make them criminal? The victim. The victim, so it is in this situation, and as he's defining and he's turning this man in a criminal, it is turning the father of her children into a criminal. As most of the cases of domestic violence, they have children in this situation. So we will find different situations. We have women that suffered a lot, but this process, this process can enable other sufferers. And when these perceptions arrive on this position, it seems that just this woman that made that this man a criminal that is not a criminal for these places, is a criminal just from the views of the woman. So these are very important things to think, and I'm quite happy for being here with you today, this reflection. And I think if there are alternatives for this system that we have today, we have to think, what are they, why, and if it is possible to work with them, trying to find something better than what we have today. And another data that draws our attention in the entire process of all the increasingly importance of the Maria da Penha law, that it is there is something within the system that will contaminate everything that it touches. And then we will think if we will live something that can be visualized with no contamination or not. So these are the reflections for us, and also the concerns are when we look at the restorative justice, we have to look at broadly, in a broader way, and not as something that we determine in some places as restorative justice. This is my idea. Thank you for your patience, and I'm sorry for the time. Thank you very much, Marilia. And subsequently, I'd like to give the floor to Professor Luana Tomás de Souza. Dear Luana, welcome. You have the floor for 15 minutes for your presentation. Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me well? Okay. Good morning. I'd like to thank the opportunity for being here in this webinar and to acknowledge the organization of the event that presents the experience from Brazil and Australia and enable us to deep our understandings on how to create interventions in violence, especially violence against women. I'd like to thank the opportunity for listening to all the presentations from the colleagues from Australia, Tammy, Andrew, and also my dear Brazilian colleagues, Marilia and Carmen, whose I have the opportunity to share tables and experiences, meetings, and also to greet Bruno and Thiago, dear colleagues, that we have also met each other in books and in our life. Well, I am quite happy for being here with Carmen and Maria. I believe we were very rich informations within the Brazilian experience, so I try to be the most objective that I can for not repeating myself. And I believe that our speeches in this sense, they connect a lot. And Carmen started her presentation with the searches about the topics with very clear, the researches correlated to just restorative justice with the possibility of implementation within the domestic family violence. And for a long time, we discussed it as an hypothesis, but today we have experiences, so the studies are possible. And it's very good for having the research that Carmen shared with us. And also it was good to listen to the reflections from Maria, the possibilities, the range. And I believe that my speech is connected to both of them in this sense that as a researcher and some of the provocations shared by them, I share as well, but also bringing in distinct experience as a person that also works with persons in a violence situation. So here, the Federal University of Pará, I'm the coordinator of project named Violence Attention Clinic. In this project, I serve women in violence situations. It's a project that we have around 15 years. I work in the service with women within domestic violence, and this debate of the restorative justice has been present in the past period of this clinic that I would like to share with you. I don't have slides presentation, but I will try to raise some reflections connecting to Carmen and Maria's presentation.
I believe today, as Carmen mentioned, for a while we were discussing if it was possible or not to apply the restorative justice in domestic violence and family violence. And we have studies, uh, even by Maria and Vera and others, that show this is a reality. And from that on, we can have critical analysis of the application of that in Brazil. I believe the main problems that were brought, especially in the studies of criminology, not only in the gender studies or domestic and family violence, is the centrality of experiences. Here in Brazil, the judiciary system has been the main promoter of restorative justice. They are the ones who create courses and promote the public debate on restorative justice in almost all states currently. And that bring a couple of issues because when the judiciary system leads an agenda as such, they will bring a different type of grammar to the debate. And I have taken some courses on restorative justice. And this is a language that comes from the judiciary system. This idea of restorative justice needs to happen and needs to happen as an alternative to the judiciary. That the number of processes or suits are too large and we must decrease that, and restorative justice may happen to decrease these processes. And we see restorative justice being redesigned, being taking ownership in this discourse that has the interest, the utilitarian interest to reduce the number of lawsuits. And that eventually, periodically, they come with solutions with family constellation sometimes, or the therapeutical justice. And now we hear the restorative justice. And with the discourse that restorative justice may take place in the space, in the states, and they must impose a form of decreasing this number of suits, especially because the domestic violence courts are the ones with the largest amount of processes. So this should take place to reduce this demand. And this comes as accessories and not to redesign the role of the judiciary system or rethink this role or how the judiciary system. So it comes as something more accessory that may be used in a lower, in a lighter situation, and at the same time contributing for a perception of banalization of banal violence. And what I see in those courses is this debate. Why have a process if there is a fight between a man and a woman that could be sorted out in mediation? So there's a way to decrease this process and incorporate it into a judiciary grammar. And this is how the restorative justice has been used in Brazil. And another problem, and Carmen has brought that, well, there is a reproduction of designs in European designs and models. You see this origin, the restorative justices, they have counter-hegemonic proposals. And many of the authors, when we talk about that, they talk about the indigenous origin and the African Aboriginal inspiration. But as a rule of thumb, the authors that are shared and the voices that are protagonists of these debates, they are ultimately European. So you don't see experiences shared that show possibilities of a South-South dialogue, that we understand experiences of conflict mediation, or even not conflict mediation from different frameworks that is not European or Western. And this ends up being an issue because during this process, we end up having a selectiveness in a different look at the conflict. So you see this conflict and the process of appropriation. So you see them as something indigenous, but it's not indigenous. It's someone European who supposedly had access to these two different experiences and made it their own reading. And this is sold as if we're sharing something indigenous. And there is a way that this shows the taking of ownership of certain knowledge of some people. Here in the northern region, where we don't have a lot of consolidated experience on that, and we've had dialogue between Carmen. We are 3 university researchers who are, well, women and white, and there's one in Northeast, South, and North. So I'll talk as someone from the northern part of Brazil, in the Amazon region. You have 5 minutes, okay? Apologize. But the northern region, we have not a lot of consolidated experience in restorative justice. The experiences that have been disseminated the most, they have this characteristic of being focused on the judiciary system, to be under logics of conflict mediation, which minimizes the potential of restorative justice, because this is not a form to sort out conflicts, and it is towards experiences for men. And the court has had meetings bringing groups for men, and then it goes back to the grammar and the corporate interest. So the Maria da Penha law determines this policies for men, and as a way to fill in this gap, the court has disseminated this idea that I will kill 2 birds with a stone, and so I must foster projects that are restorative justice towards men as a way to fill out these gaps. So I need to have programs for men. So I must have cycles for that. So the court has had meetings fostering experiences toward men that use restorative justice for that. And this has created something, well, issues for us as researchers. And talking about the Amazon region, we see that those debates, even incorporating this European reference, they do not reflect on the Amazonian reality. So there is no debate on issues that are specific from the region, like the lack of public policies and the diversity of women, especially the riparian women, and many of them are from the countryside, and many of them, they suffer violence in the capitals, and policies that involve a reality in the Amazon has been identified, such as deforestation, the decrease of housing, and the environmental poverty, and many others. And this has created a strong debate in the part that I'm in this area that I'm part of. And what we have tried to reflect is here, and that's why we believe we talk to Marilia as and we are reflecting and what we have there's a possibility of restorative justice, so in the legal system, in the agenda, especially towards the perpetrators in the individual conflicts. So what we show in the clinic is the possibility, the restorative to women, and those programs to be focused on central aspects. One, which is facing the violence beyond individual perspective. When we talk about when we're talking about violence, and Carmen has talked about that, gender violence, we're talking about the harm, the aggression, or the assault of one versus another, but the system that violates women, women every day, which is a misogynistic and racist area that brings different issues to the lives of these women. And during the pandemic, we could notice quite clearly some cases that we saw women that suffered sexual violence. They would say, oh, I can't deal with that right now because I need to know what am I going to eat, where I'm going to live. So there were other issues that are even more urgent problems with, well, motherhood. One thing is to face violence, and the other one is, how will I survive with 3 children? How can I work with 3 children? What do I do if the daycare center is far? If my kid asks me, many women, they feel responsible after violence to this hyper maternity, as if she would be responsible for the whole violence, and they must be the best mother, and they must account for all the needs of that child. And so what we have tried to develop with the women that we see in the clinic, well, we have designed the possibility of restorative programs with these women that strengthen the bonds of solidarity among them. They are focused in a logic that brings the state as a promoter of this policy to face it, to tackle it, but to allow them to create bonds among them and to build collectively ways to face this structuring violence. So we have some cycles, some lectures on motherhood, which was recurring in the women that we have. And these initial experiences have been quite successful. Some of them were able to work this feeling of guilt, of grieving, independence, and in this very space. But this may be something that will restore bonds and sociability. Many women, they were seeing logics of isolation, of guilt and depression, and we saw some cycles where they could share these possibilities and to hear one another and to build collectively forms to deal with that. And this has been quite interesting, in fact, because the Latin American feminism has shown, and has been a lot of campaigns in Latin America, and that is fundamental to foster the bonds among women. And we must find ways out, especially in a region as ours, in the Amazon region, where the state is quite absent, and you don't have where to send these women. And the professionals, sometimes they don't know what to do with this violence in such an absence of public policies. And we have assessed that this may be an interesting horizon. So not using the restorative justice to strengthen the expectations of the judiciary system to fill their own gaps, but to use the restorative justice as a mechanism to strengthen the livelihoods of these women. And that's what I wanted to bring with you. I believe I took my 15 minutes, and I'd like to thank you immensely and make myself available to the debate. Well, thank you very much, Luana. I'd like to thank all of you. The presentations were quite inspiring, and we still have some 5 minutes, Thiago, I believe, for some questions. And some of them have been asked. And Tiago, you asked one in Portuguese. Would you like to ask it directly? Well, we have interpretation. So, well, my question for Tammy and Andrew, and I'd like to use this great opportunity of having you with us and to talk about that. Well, it's a couple of points that, from what you have mentioned, we would have more to learn from. Well, you said one of the objectives of the restorative justice process, besides promoting the safety and the sort out of the issues, is also to ensure the actual accountability of the offender. So this principle, and my question is, how does that work to use these interventions to try and promote this accountability? Well, my question is, this accountability is to be the very eligibility, or if there's an objective, or if this is going to reach throughout the intervention. And a second question about that is, well, we talked about that, how important it is to have in the restorative process the participation of reliable people or trustworthy people, both for the victims and the perpetrator. So the question is, how will we guarantee the safety, or I mean, for the people who are participating in the restorative process, because they themselves will not replicate the gender stereotypes during the discussions, and bring the culpability to the women, or to endorse the construction of a solution that at the end of the day will be a not so good solution under this perspective of gender. So this would be the two questions I'd have. Thank you. Tiago, I'll just build on one that you asked. What type of indicators, if you consider accountability as a criteria, what type of indicator do you consider in this experience in Victoria for the accountability to take place? How is this practically done? I mean, or done in practice? Thank you.
Thanks, Tiago. Thanks, Bruno, for those questions. I might start, Tammy, and then feel free to jump in if I miss anything, or if you have anything to add. Yeah, it's probably the one of, if not the most difficult parts of our work, is the involvement of the offender, or the perpetrator, the person responsible for causing the harm. It's a field of work, I think, in Victoria that still has a bit of a way to go beyond just restorative justice, but how the system can adequately respond to people who have caused harm in family violence, whether that's through the support of the victim survivor, or through interventions specifically designed to increase perpetrator accountability. For us in our program, it won't ever be a specific goal of a restorative process to increase accountability of a perpetrator. unless that can help reach the goals of the victim survivor that we're working with. So our entire process and the goals that we're trying to achieve will always be based around the victim survivor that we're working with. So that means that level of accountability, if a perpetrator is going to be involved, that level of accountability that's there can be different in each case, and it will be dependent on the needs of the victim survivor. So in some cases, victim survivors might not need to hear from the perpetrator at all. Some might not need to hear about their level of accountability or hear them say sorry. That, you know, the demonstration of an apology or saying sorry might just resemble the cycle of violence that they've already been through with a perpetrator who might cause the harm and then apologise afterwards. So the victim survivor might not be interested in hearing that at all. They still might want them involved and just want to be heard and tell their story and make sure that the perpetrator can understand the harm that they've experienced. So it will, I guess, it won't ever be the purpose of our restorative work to increase that accountability, but we hope that if a perpetrator is involved, it will be an outcome. So I guess you could almost frame it as secondary outcome of our work would be to increase that accountability or awareness of offending from the perpetrator side of things. And I guess in terms of participants and not replicating those, I guess, the gender stereotypes and things that underlie causes of violence against women, I guess the key safeguard there is our team, and especially the work that Tammy and Sylvia do as specialist support workers, being specialists in working in family violence and working with people who have experienced harm as a result of family violence, and our conveners as well, making sure that initial preparation work and assessment work is really thorough. So anyone who is involved will do so to help the victim survivor reach those goals that they've identified. And that's part of that assessment and preparation work, to identify that anyone that's going to be involved is able to do so safely, that they believe the victim survivor. It's another key part of our work. The victim survivor's story is never disputed in our program, so that they believe the victim survivor, that they're involved because they're motivated to deliver benefit to the victim survivor through our restorative processes. And I guess, Bruno, your question about sort of what do we exactly look for in terms of perpetrators and that acceptance of responsibility. Often we look to involve experts in that space as well. There are programs in Victoria, one especially called No to Violence, that work with perpetrators or people who've caused harm through family violence. So we look to seek outside expert advice at times as well. Other times it's just, you know, conversations and work with that through that preparation stage with the perpetrator to assess. We don't have sort of set criteria yet. That might be something we look to develop as the program matures, and we develop a bit more of a framework for working with perpetrators. But it's just, I guess, matching up the assessments and work with the perpetrator against those needs of the victim survivor, and being able to meet those safely. Anything to add there, Tammy?
I guess the only things that I thought about asking is just around the notion of accountability. In my work with victim survivors, that's really about validation and acknowledgement. So very seldom are victim survivors after an apology, but they really want the other person that caused them harm to understand the impact of the violence, what that impact of violence had on them. So I guess that after that acknowledgement of that experience and that validation and that understanding, some form of an expression that they've understood the impact of their behavior. And the other thing that I would add is that if you go back to the principles of restorative justice, one of the key principles that Andrew spoke about is to do no further harm. So in that preparation process and along the way, if we get the sense, both the conveners and the specialist support workers, if our practitioners get the sense that, you know, that to bring the victim survivor together with the perpetrator would cause further harm to someone, then we would not do it. So yeah, so I hope that answers those questions as well.
Obrigado. Mais alguma consideração,
Thank you
Tiago?
very much, Thiago. Any other question? Do you still have time? No?
Eu pediria talvez
Okay.
5 minutinhos a mais aí de tolerância para os nossos visitantes. Eu sei que normalmente nós
Maybe we can have
ali no horário. A gente do Brasil,
5 minutes more. I would like to request that our foreign guests, maybe they are rigorous that in Brazil we are flexible, just to ask our Brazilian participants if you have any question for our Australian guests.
Eu queria só rapidamente.
Very briefly, I don't know if I missed Tim and Andrew, if your program works with children or only adult persons, because the example that you gave, it was a person with the suffered the sexual abuse in the childhood. But I'd like to know, do you have cases of children or only adult persons?
Thanks, Carmen. We primarily work with adult victim survivors as our primary clients, but often we'll have perhaps adult or older children involved because of that family dynamic. We have identified adolescent violence in the home as I guess our next sort of step as a program to move into, as a particular space that has the opportunities for restorative justice to provide great benefit as a response to adolescents that are using violence in the home. We're not quite working in that space yet, but have that on our sort of top of our to-do list to move into over the next 6 to 12 months. And we'll undertake some further consultation and design work for our program to make sure that we're adequately equipped. But at the moment, primarily work with adult victim survivors as the clients.
Yeah. And that case example, Carmen, that I spoke about historical childhood sexual abuse, both of those participants, the brother and the sister, they're adults now. So it was just about talking about the harm that occurred when they were kids, but they are now participating as adults.
Mais alguma? Tem uma que foi
Any
feita.
other question? We have one for Carmen. Carmen, maybe after a few years of the publication of your book, if you can identify a relevant change or substantial change today or any example, so please share with us. Look, I think so. The book was published in 2017, so we have a lot of things that has been developed later on, and I think that other perspectives, mainly the chronologies from the South, that the book indicates, but it didn't discuss this perspective. So I think that the work, the decolonial chronologies of the South, they are today becoming very interesting perspective for us to think, as Luana said, from the South experience. So look at the South from our experience of restorative justice in the South region, how our experience have been taking place there, bringing forward restorative justice. And I think that it can enrich the Latin American debate following this perspective. For instance, issues that the Black women movement works and brings to the debate of restorative justice within the prisonal system as a policy of for the prison situation. So we think we need to look at these experiences and these perspectives that I think will enrich different other perspectives that we have been considered the restorative justice so far. I have one question for Luana specifically. I'd like to listen from you, as you come from a rich region with different experiences with indigenous peoples. If you, from the best of your knowledge, if you can detect any experience close to restorative justice in these communities, something that we can learn from our experiences. Would you capable during your researches to detect something similar to that? We had experiences of restorative justice in the inward of the state. But as I said, we have a understand of the conflict that is individualized and a West understanding. We want to find an experience where an indigenous man and an indigenous woman, they sat and discussed their violence. And this is a perspective in a resolution design that is of ours, that are from the West and the white design. We found experience from realities of traditional peoples, bringing, for instance, the collectiveness involving issues around occupations or land use, environmental conflicts, and it impacts directly the day of these women, because their fight is a collective fight, collective struggle, and for many times the fight for the protection of the specific region. I followed the debate of women in a traditional community, and they said when they suffered violence, their comfort was the forest, and they needed to protect the forest because the forest was the place that they lived, they slept, they protected them. So it's a different situation from what we have to have a man in front of the woman and try to solve that conflict. In a situation such this current situation that they have the increasing violence against indigenous peoples, the deforestation and the land use conflict, these peoples, they are concerning about surviving. So it's quite common to these places and areas, and even with the food insecurity growing, this out later I will handle with this issue because look, we don't have food here, so people have no food. So for many times, all the debates, all the discussions, all the issues, they overlap this one. So it's important to think that how can we work in a region to have a restorative conference if people they are concerned about what they will eat next day. So I think this a whole different universe of debate that involves other expectations beyond these ones. Can I add something to that? I agree, Luana, with you. I think that this is the idea of harm. There's a social harm idea that is from comes from the green technology. So if we appropriate from the green criminology of social harm, it goes beyond this individualist logic that the criminal system brought, that the restorative justice incorporated, because it all only looks at the individual harm. So we need to expand the notion of harm, that is the harm to the forest, food, and impact, including individual situations. But we need a wider view, and this is the challenge that we need to have in this experience from the northern region of the country. They are very important because we are inside boxes from these west boxes that do not look at our realities from other possibilities. And I have another question for the colleagues of Australia. They said they need to finish. If it is 30 seconds, we can do it because our team, don't have a time. We can finish. I just would like to ask, because here in Brazil, most of the violence cases, they are related to racial issues, that Black women that suffer violence. if from their experience, racism is an element to face. But I believe that this is a question that we will not be capable to answer in 30 seconds, but I really think the dialogue with you. Yes, they have a real problem with traditional peoples in Australia. It's a very critical thing there. Well, so Bruno, you finish? Yes, I'd like to thank again everyone. It was an evening, an afternoon, very interesting. Angel, Tammy, Carmen, Maria, Luana. It was excellent to have this opportunity, and I thank everyone. And I give the floor to Thiago for the final acknowledgement as the organizer of the event. And once again, thank you, everyone. This is it, just to register acknowledgement and thank everyone, to express my gratitude, and especially the patience of the translators team that stayed with us for these 15 additional minutes. Thank you thank you all the Australian participants and the Brazilian. I know we have the high level, high quality participants here to finish this series of webinars, Brazil and Australia. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Andrew, thanks very much.